My brother told me I was selfish for not letting him borrow my house while I was away, so I came back early and found out what he'd actually been doing inside. I'm 26F. My brother, let's call him Matt, is 29. We've always been close-ish. Family dinners, shared holidays, the usual stuff. I bought a small 3-bed row house 2 years ago and have been slowly fixing it up. It's my first real adult thing that's only mine, which is exactly why what happens still stings. Short version. Matt begged to use my house while I had a week-long work trip. I said no because of a string of small boundary issues he's had. He called me selfish in front of our parents and friends, guilted me, and I left anyway. I came back 2 days early and walked into a full-on short-term rental/party operation with strangers, damage, and cash jars. Long version below, how I planned the trip, what I found, how I handled it, and what happened after. A little background, so this doesn't read like she's mean. Matt's a good person in a lot of ways, but he's impulsive, forgetful with promises, and he's flirts with get-rich-quick schemes. He's crashed on my couch more times than I'll admit, and each time he swore it was a one-off. A month before my trip, he asked if he could borrow the house while I was out. Host a few friends, get some quiet space. That line. I said no. I was planning a trip that required clean sheets for guests I was hosting when I got back, and I didn't want strangers in my house. Also, there had been a few nights where he'd left my door unlocked or had friends over, and I'd come home to noise. Boundaries felt reasonable. He didn't like that. He accused me of being controlling during a family dinner, right after I said no. You've got a nice place, Ratch. Are you really going to make me sleep on a couch when I'm trying to get my life in order? You're being selfish. Mom gave him the look people give their child who's suddenly reasonable enough to be forgiven. Dad sighed and said something about helping family out. It turned into a small argument and then a guilt trip. I stuck to my decision. 2 days before I left, he asked again and offered to pay for utilities and do any cleanup. I told him if he wanted my house that badly, he could sign an Airbnb-style agreement and buy the cleaning supplies he'd need. He laughed it off and said, "Come on, Ratch, it's family." I said no again and left for my trip with a bit of a pit in my stomach, but resolute. While I was away, I tried to relax. Work was intense. The trip was supposed to be a reset. I sent the occasional text to check in on the house. Matt sent a few have fun messages and photos of him at the local pub, which I assumed was a harmless check-in. Then about halfway through my trip, I got a message from a neighbor. "Hey, did you know your house is listed on that short-term rental app? People keep showing up." My stomach dropped. I messaged Matt. He replied with a shrug emoji and, "Oh right, yeah, some mates needed a place for a weekend. Sorted it." That was it. No permission asked, no cleaning fee paid. No, I'll take care of it. I wasn't furious, yet I was in that incredulous, sinking place where you hope there's an explanation. I tried calling, no answer. I emailed the rental platform asking for removal if they were guests without authorization. They replied with a standard form email and said I need to contact the account holder, which was useless. I could have stayed on the trip, called my parents and made them handle it, or flown home immediately and had a calmer scene. But I did something I'd never done before. I changed my return flight and came home 2 days early. I didn't want to leave whatever was happening at my house dangling while I was halfway across the country. What I walked into was worse than what I'd feared. Update. Same day. The sun was low, and the end of the street smelled like cut grass. My mailbox had a stack of flyers shoved in it. The front garden looked trampled. The door was unlocked. I had a key, so I didn't think much of it at first. Matt has a key, he stayed there before. But as soon as I pushed the door open, I heard voices. Music dim and loud. Laughter. Clinking glasses. The living room lights were strobing in the way people choose when they're trying to create vibe. There were people on the couch, strangers, couples, a guy asleep with his shoe off. And the place smelled like smoke and spilled beer. My heart hammered. My first move was to lock the door behind me quietly. I wanted to observe and not create a scene where people could run off, and I'd be left with a mess. Then I started to look. There were at least 5 mattresses in the back room. Sheets were pulled back on my spare bed. My kitchen counter had a jar with cash and a handwritten sign, "Leave £30/night." A post-it on the microwave said, "Check in 2 p.m., key it bin." I went upstairs and saw an extra set of disposable cups by the bathroom, a bunch of empty takeout boxes, and, worse, a stack of clothes on my bedroom chair that weren't mine, and not just guests' clothes, but multiple wallets and a lanyard from a corporate event. My wardrobe had been rummaged through. A cheap mattress was set up in the study with a guy asleep on it, headphones on, mouth open. I felt something break in me, not just the house, but the basic trust that someone in my family could behave this way. I packed the evidence as calmly as I could. Photos of the jar, the mattresses, the lounge full of people. I didn't want to escalate into violence. I wanted clear documentation. I found Matt in the kitchen, nostrils flared from a cigarette he'd been sneaking in the back garden. He looked guilty, but also blatantly unapologetic. Ratch, what are you doing back? He said like I'd gatecrashed a festival he'd organized for charity. What is going on here? I asked quietly. His immediate move was to charm the room. Guests, this is my sister. She changes her flights sometimes. He laughed nervously. We ran a little thing for friends. You turn my house into a paid short-term rental without asking me, I said, voice low. He tried the we needed cash line next. It was only for the weekend. Rent's high. People pay. We covered bills. I asked to see the listing. He didn't have one. He had printouts of messages from people who'd paid him via Cash App that morning. He'd been running this for at least a week. Nights, check-ins, people leaving reviews to a private group chat he'd made with guests. I asked about the jar. He shrugged. It's to cover the cleaning, he said. I'd find out later the jar had almost 500 pounds in it and a few crumpled notes that weren't matching any real cleaning expenses I'd estimated. I told him to get everyone out. He looked at me like I was being dramatic. The guests were confused and annoyed. They'd paid thinking they had a legitimate booking. That was a new wrinkle. 2 men insisted they had a confirmation link. I demanded they leave. Chaos rippled across the living room like an animal spooked. Someone said, "We can stay. She's not the owner," which was a wild sentence to hear. These were people not accustomed to the idea that their host might not be a legitimate operator. I called my dad. He's on the blunt side. When he answered and I told him, he said to lock the doors and wait for him. In the meantime, I asked the group to sit down while I figured out how to handle it. One young woman started to cry because she was 3 flights in and thought she had a place for the weekend. A guy argued loudly that he'd paid double and didn't want to be on the street. I'd promised a clean home and returned to find it turned into a mini factory of strangers. My head was spinning. When Dad arrived 20 minutes later, he saw the jar, the mattresses, and the general chaos, and his face did something I'd never seen on him. It went flush, like hot anger. He marched to Matt and asked bluntly, why? Matt stammered about money again. Dad told him to start refunding people now. They argued in the hallway, words rising and falling. A guy threatened to call the police. I felt equal parts humiliation and relief that my family now had front row seats to what had been happening under their noses. Update, next 48 hours. We spent the night dealing with logistics. Some guests left after refunds. Some were angry. One couple stayed in a cheap motel down the road after we paid for them. I can't stomach people stranded in the night. I took inventory of what was damaged. Scratched floorboard in the living room from a mattress frame. A wine stain in the upstairs rug that didn't come out with a cleaner. A busted lamp. I called the short-term rental platform and got them to pull any suspected listings tied to my phone number and bank account. Matt locked himself in the back garden and said I was being dramatic and could chill. Families sided in waves. Mom called me dramatic and didn't you know rent is expensive? Which was an old refrain I'd heard when standing up for myself. Dad was furious. He made Matt refund everyone he could and told him to remove all listings and accounts. I stayed up that night making a folder of receipts, screenshots of messages, and videos of the living room with people there. I slept on the sofa where someone had been earlier and listened for creaks that weren't there before. Matt apologized to some guests, but not to me. He said he'd pay for damages. He didn't. He also had the gall to tell mutual friends that I'd kicked out the guests and made it awkward, which flipped the victim script he'd used before onto me. That part is important. He didn't just betray my trust. He tried to shape the story of what happened. People's reaction matters in practical ways. Will landlords call? Will employers hear gossip? I'd seen that pattern before, and it's why I took screenshots and kept a timeline. Update, 2 weeks later. I decided to be surgical about the consequences. I posted a short note in the neighborhood group, no names, warning about an unauthorized rental at my address so other locals wouldn't unwittingly host guests. I contacted the local council's short-term rental office to report unlicensed activity on my property, not to ruin people, but because there are safety rules and our neighborhood already has issues with noise. They opened an investigation. I also called my insurance to report possible liability exposure and took photos for claims. Most importantly, I sat Matt down and gave him a list. Refund everyone, pay for damages, and find a place to stay if he could be trusted in my home. He promised. He didn't have the money. He tried to pawn off responsibility on the guests. They agreed to pay me, he said, which is rich considering he turned my assets into a business, without my permission. Dad, who's not one for long moral lectures, gave him a short ultimatum, repay the guests, or figure out a different roof to sleep under. He scrambled. He moved out of the spare room into a friend's sofa. He sold a few of his things online, apparently to refund people, and even took on a temp gig. It was humiliating to watch, but it had to be practical. I didn't want the house tied to his volatility. We fixed the damage. I hired a cleaner, replaced the lamp, sanded the scratched board. The total bill was more than the jar money. I asked Matt for the receipts he'd taken and his Cash App records. He produced some, but it was messy. I learned a lesson about boundaries and ownership in the most unpleasant way. Final update, 3 months later. 3 months after I walked in on the chaos, I'm back to normalcy that feels deliberate. I installed a smart lock that I control and updated all the alarm codes. I changed the Wi-Fi password and froze joint bank accounts I never should have had in the first place. The house is back to being mine in a practical sense. New rug, newly tightened kitchen cabinets. Insurance claims settled mostly in my favor because I had photos and invoices. Matt and I talk less. We aren't estranged in a cinematic way, but the easy closeness we had is gone. He called once to say he'd found a steady job and to apologize again. I accepted the apology in a small, practical way. We had a coffee and spoke about boundaries, not feelings. He understands the door he burned, and he's working to patch his life without mine serving as a safety net. Our parents are quieter on the issue than I'd like. Mom still insists he's learning, and Dad keeps a practical distance. Some family friends stopped inviting us both over. Others kept coming, awkward but present. People ask if I regret not letting him use the house. No. I regret not setting even stricter boundaries earlier and sending clearer consequences sooner. I regret the stress and the fact strangers slept in my home without my permission. But I don't regret protecting the space that I worked for. If you're wondering what I did to win, there wasn't a dramatic revenge. I documented, I acted fast, I got official help, and I fortified what was mine. I didn't yell him off the planet or kick him in public. I made sure the story wasn't mine to be written by him. He learned the hard way that borrowing someone's life asset without consent is theft in practice, not just an emotion. On the last day, I replaced the scratched floorboard myself. It felt good in an ordinary, quiet way. I put the old lamp in the donation bag and took a breath. I locked the door behind me, and the sound of the bolt clicking felt, for once, exactly like the end of something that had been out of control. This is the end.